Our topic today is caring for the world together. Now, I think we all have a pretty fair idea of how to care for the world. That's not what I'm really going to talk about, because for me the key word in this phrase is together. If we are not together, I don't think it matters what plans we have to care for the world. We're not likely to succeed. On the other hand, if we are together, I think caring for the world will be the natural result. It won't be a struggle. It won't be a problem. So the key to caring for the world is finding a way to come together. Now, people have been trying to do that for thousands of years, at least. And there's something that we're missing. There's some part of coming together that we're not getting. So that's what I'd like to talk about today. It's what in the ancient times was called practicing the presence. And what it has to do with is the idea that, yes, we have a physical body, a physical level to our being, but we also have an emotional level, a mental level, and a spiritual level. 4 levels of our being. And what I have found, at least in my experience and observation, is that it's very possible, in fact it's very likely for us in this time to have our attention focused on the mental plane. I remember in my late 20s, sitting down for dinner one night, I took my first bite of food and it was so painful I couldn't chew. And that was the first indication that I had that there was something wrong, something going on that I wasn't aware of. I thought that must be a dental problem, so I went to the dentist. And he said, no, your teeth are fine. What's going on is you have temporomandibular joint dysfunction. Well, I said, well, what's that? And he said, well, you're clenching your jaws. You're probably grinding your teeth in your sleep. And I said, well, what causes this? And he said, it's stress. Well, this was a big surprise to me because I didn't think I had any stress at all. I thought I was the most stress-free person in the world. And so what I realized had happened as I began to get in touch with this stress, this clenching of my jaw and my teeth, what I realized what had happened was my awareness, my attention had been so focused on the mental plane that I was cut off from what my physical body was feeling. And later I realized also I was cut off from what my emotional body was feeling. Because the dentist had said, start trying to yawn every chance you get. Notice when you're when you're clenching, when you're too tense. And I started to notice, I started to pay attention. I started to yawn and realize, oh, I'm letting go of tension. I would be driving my car and realize I was holding the steering wheel like this, and I could just relax. I was a pinball wizard in those days, pretty good at the game, but I realized that even though these are electronic knobs that you click, and it doesn't matter how hard you press them, it's when you press them that those flippers are going to flip. I was getting my back into it. I was putting a lot of pressure on these buttons, so I started to just relax and just flick the buttons with very little effort at all. And actually my game improved, my timing got much better. So why am I telling you this? Because I'm trying to give you this idea that it's possible for us to have our attention focused on one plane, specifically the mental plane, and be unaware of what's happening in our bodies, the physical plane, or in our feelings, the emotional plane, or, and this is what I've been wanting to get to, we can be unaware of what's happening on the spiritual plane, our own spiritual level of our own being. Practicing the presence is becoming conscious of what's happening on your own spiritual level and choosing to hold the presence of God from moment to moment. So I want to give you an example of that. When I was very young, I was bitten by a dog. Not very seriously, but it gave me a fear of dogs. So all the time growing up as a child, as a teenager, as a young man, I had this fear of dogs. I didn't have a dog, didn't want to be around dogs, but in my probably mid-20s, in the midst of my spiritual studies, I was at a place where I would take a long walk every day, and this was a somewhat rural area. There were no sidewalks, at least, and so I would walk down the middle of the street, and this was a neighborhood where everybody had a big yard and a lot of people had big dogs. So I'd walk down the middle of the street and the dogs would come out and I would feel fear. I had a vision in my head of a dog biting my hand and blood running out. But in my spiritual studies, I'd come across a commentary on the Bible that was quoting someplace, I don't know exactly where, but it said, "Perfect love casts out fear." So I thought, great, here's a spiritual teaching I can use. I started to go on my walk, and from moment to moment, instant to instant, just continuously, I said over and over, I'm holding the presence of love. I'm holding the presence of love. So now I was paying attention to what's happening in my own spiritual level. Because whereas our physical bodies, we know pretty well, our emotional level, our emotional body is where our feelings are. Our mental body is where our thoughts are. And our spiritual body, or the spiritual level of our being, is the presence. That's where the presence that we're entertaining resides. We as human beings have this tremendous gift, this power, that we can consciously choose the presence we are going to entertain on the spiritual level of our being. And that's what I was doing. I was saying, I'm holding the presence of love. And I went on my walk, and these dogs came out barking, and I felt the fear, but it had nowhere to grip, nowhere to grab onto me. I wasn't in the grip of fear because I was filling myself with love. I was holding the presence of love. The fear came, and I felt it, but I felt it rush up and out. So I learned that it's possible to hold one feeling and still be feeling something else. You can hold the presence of love and something may happen that makes you angry, but the anger doesn't get you, it doesn't take over. You feel the anger and then it goes. Disappointment, frustration, you can still feel the full range of emotions, but if you're consciously choosing to hold the presence of love, you're experiencing them in the presence of love, which is very, very different from being gripped by these various what I would call presences. So I was no longer holding the presence of fear. I was holding the presence of love. And I didn't get rid of the fear by saying, oh, fear, go away, or fighting the fear. I got rid of the fear eventually by consistently, moment to moment, consciously choosing to hold the presence of love. And it took some time and some dedication. I went out from my walk every day, and I'd say it took 3 to 4 weeks of facing my fear, consciously choosing to hold the presence of love, practicing the presence of love on my walk, the fear coming and rushing out. But gradually it was less. Gradually it was less until finally the fear didn't even come. I felt completely safe. Because one other thing that this spiritual teaching I came across had said was that not only does perfect love cast out fear, but the presence of love protects you. It's like putting on the whole armor of God. So I no longer felt at the mercy of the dogs. I felt like I was safe in the presence of God, in the presence of love. And I thought I had overcome my fear of dogs. And then one day soon after, I was out on my walk, saying I'm holding the presence of love. I had even made some friends with some of the dogs. Some of them were doing their guard dog duty. But I was confident. I felt safe. And then I heard a bark that sounded like you could hear it for miles. And I turned and I saw a dog I'd never seen before, and he was huge, racing at me. He had intelligent looking eyes that looked like they had killed before and they were going to kill again. And he was foaming at the mouth. It was like the Hound of the Baskervilles in real life, coming straight at me. And I stood there and I said, I'm holding the presence of love. I'm holding the presence of love. And I could feel that love, just like waves coming out from me. And that dog cut through those waves like a hot knife through butter. And he bit my hand. And he had no teeth. And he ran away whimpering with his tail between his legs. Another part of this teaching is that if you face your fear, you find it has no power. But if you run from your fear, you run forever. So I tell you this story to give you an example of what it's like to practice the presence, to consciously choose to hold the presence of God. In this case, I was thinking of God as love. You may practice the presence of truth, or truth and love, or peace. You can practice the presence of peace, because these are all divine qualities, and in doing this, you're practicing the presence of God or goodness. This may be one of, if not the most important realization I ever had. Because this is what true worship is. In the Gospels, Jesus says in the end time, many will cry to me, Lord, Lord, and I will say, you honored me with your lips, but you did not do what I asked you to do. So in other words, praising God is not holding anger and judgment and animosity and jealousy and insecurity and self-criticism and going to church and saying, praise God. That's not it. What you worship is the presence that you entertain in your being. When you entertain the presence of God, of goodness, and hold the presence of love on the spiritual level, hold it in your heart, you're worshiping God. If you allow something to knock the presence of God out, and now you've got fear there, or anger, or guilt, you're entertaining the presence of fear. You're entertaining the presence of anger. You're entertaining the presence of guilt. And this means you're worshiping a false God. You're breaking the first commandment. The only way to truly worship God is to practice the presence, to consciously hold the presence of love from moment to moment, instant to instant, throughout your entire day. And what about the people in the past who you may have judged and said, oh, well, there's a sinner. There's somebody who's going to hell. There's somebody who's ruining the world. Well, we don't want to practice the presence of criticism or judgment. And Jesus said, do not judge, or you will be judged. He said, even if you call a man a fool, you will be liable to judgment. He said that the sun shines because it's its nature to shine, not because the people on earth deserve the sunlight, or some deserve it and some don't. The sun doesn't judge, doesn't withhold its light because it judges someone isn't worthy. The sun shines because it is the nature of the sun to shine. God loves because it is God's nature to love. And if we practice the presence of love, that means that we are going to be loving towards everyone all the time, not secretly harboring judgments or criticisms or condemnations. And this is so important because God's way is not about us trying to fix other people by our own efforts. God's way is not about separating out the true believers from the others and condemning the others. God's way is to hold the presence of love, be loving towards everyone, and allow that love to transform anyone who can be transformed. Allow God to do the work. Our work is to just practice the presence, to let God's love come through us towards everyone. And if we do that, miracles can happen. Love has the power to transform the sinner, but not if we're judging and condemning and criticizing or ostracizing the sinner. Jesus didn't ostracize the sinner. He had sat down to meals with the taxpayer. He associated with the prostitute. He was seen with the leper. He didn't ostracize. He didn't cut himself off. He was loving towards everyone, and that had a healing effect on everyone. And this, I believe, is the thing that will allow us to come together, because love attracts. If you're truly practicing the presence of love, you will begin to attract people, because love is attractive. Judgment, condemnation, criticism is scattering. So we have to ask ourselves, do we want to be scatterers or do we want to be gatherers? Do we want to be judges or do we want to be transformers? And it's the lack of this realization, the lack of practicing the presence of love and nothing but love, that I think has kept us from coming together to care for the earth. And so I strive, and I encourage you to strive, to be conscious of the presence you're entertaining. Now, it can be tricky, because in the old days, I think fear or guilt may have been called a demon. In modern times, we might call it a psychological complex or a psychic complex. The way I view it is that fear actually is a disembodied thing, that if allowed to come into your presence, it's like a psychic vampire. It sucks energy. That's why it is there, and that's why it wants to stay there. And it works like a magician. You know, a magician, a worldly magician, is someone who misdirects your attention. They'll have you looking here while they're doing something over there, and suddenly you go, oh, it's magic, right? So what does fear do? Fear says, oh, you better watch out for this. And so right away your attention is drawn to your thinking. So you're on the mental plane. You're not even aware of the presence you're entertaining. You're not aware of this monkey on your back that's whispering thoughts. You know, in the Bible, the adversary is referred to as the prince of the powers of the air. And in the old days, the earth was the physical level, the water was the emotional level, the air was the mental level, and the fire was the spiritual level. So the prince of the powers of the air is someone who's able to whisper discouraging thoughts into your mental plane, or fearful thoughts, or guilt thoughts. And that's what they do. If you argue and you say, oh no, I don't have to be afraid of that, the fear will just say, oh yeah, but what about this? And it's the same thing with guilt. Guilt will keep your attention on the mental plane, suggesting that you should feel guilty about this or guilty about that. And if you realize, no, I'm not responsible for that, or I don't need to feel guilty for that, or I didn't know better, guilt will just point your attention at something else and say, be guilty of that. All the while, sitting up there, sucking our energy on the spiritual plane. So the idea is not to keep talking to the monkey on your back, but to say, okay, I don't want a monkey on my back, I want God. And choose the presence of love. That will cast out the fear, that will cast out the guilt, or any other disturbing presence that tries to keep your attention focused on the mental plane, including the presence of judging others, criticizing, condemning, saying, oh, they're sinners, but I'm not. No, all we want is to hold the presence of love and let God's love do its transformative work on others in its own good time. So this is the message that I wanted to give on this day when we're being mindful of caring for the earth and International Peace Day, of being peaceful. How do we be peaceful? How do we come together? This, I think, is a real powerful method, if not the method. So thank you very much for listening. And amen.